Sonia Mitchell was just a teenager when she met Brian Swartz.
She thought he was everything.
The young couple built a life together and had 3 children.
They were very happy, very loving.
She kind of felt like her life had become complete.
But after 10 years, Sonia would suddenly be a single mother.
Brian Swartz had gone missing.
There might have been some foul play involved.
The search for answers would expose all of Brian's secrets.
Brian Swartz apparently made his living by selling drugs.
But the secrets Sonia was keeping would horrify everyone.
Something very violent had happened in that house.
He was going to set me on fire.
And we were like, wow.
And the authorities would be left wondering, was it really foul play?
This mattress was just this stain of blood and tissue and bone.
Or was it justice?
It was either him or her.
I slapped her. I don't know what to tell you.
Pueblo, Colorado, September 4th, 2009. It was Labor Day weekend in this blue-collar town of 100,000, an hour and a half south of Denver.
Pueblo's an industrial city, unlike many Colorado cities, because we have a steel mill here.
But there are also plenty of wide-open spaces just outside of town. And one resident, a retired wildlife officer, was dove hunting up on the prairie west of Pueblo when he spotted something curious.
Animals were digging around in the area, which interested him to find out what they were digging up.
He went and began digging a little further and found what he believed to be human remains.
Investigators with the Pueblo County Sheriff's Office were soon on the scene.
We pulled up and the wildlife officer pointed out to me where he had been digging. We walked over to the site where I saw what appeared to me to be a human skull.
And considering where it was found, how the dead body got there wasn't much of a leap.
It would not be common in any way for a person to be buried in an extremely small, very shallow grave under 2 feet. So you have to suspect that there's potential for foul play.
But before they could figure out just who put the body there, the authorities would have to identify it, which led the investigators at the scene to make a couple of calls. One was to a forensic anthropologist.
A forensic anthropologist uses clues from the skeleton to, first of all, identify somebody or help identify somebody.
The other was to the Pueblo police.
I contacted the Pueblo Police Department investigation sergeant and asked him if he had any missing persons cases they were working.
And the answer the investigator got just might have been the break he needed.
They did have a missing person under some suspicious circumstances.
The Pueblo police were currently investigating the disappearance of 30-year-old Brian Swartz, the victim of an alleged kidnapping.
His girlfriend, Sonia Mitchell, had reported that Brian was taken by some Mexican nationals.
She said they were going to basically, whack him out.
Could the 2 cases be connected? And if so, did the body in the shallow grave mean the kidnappers had carried out their threat? Or was there another reason that someone would want Brian dead? A secret that only his 24-year-old girlfriend, Sonia, knew. Born in 1985, Sonia Mitchell started life in El Paso, Texas, the middle of 3 sisters.
Me and Sonia are 3 years apart. Me and Priscilla are 5 years apart.
It wasn't a happy childhood.
Their father was on drugs. I don't know. It was just, I kind of gave up there for a while.
It was scary. It was depressing. It was frustrating, seeing the abuse. And I didn't know what really was going on or what was happening next.
And when Sonia's father went to prison on drug charges in 1993, Margaret was determined to give her kids a better life.
He had a 3-year sentence. My mom took the opportunity and she left.
You see your mom getting hit, it's not right. Somebody talks to you bad, it's not right. I was trying to break the chain.
To make that break, Margaret took the girls to Colorado.
My mom wanted to be with her family, so she moved back to Pueblo, Colorado.
I got my apartment, I got a job at the nursing home, and we started doing good.
However, while her mother was able to make a fresh start, the transition was difficult on 10-year-old Sonia, who had a hard time adjusting to her new town and new school.
Sonia felt kind of like an outcast. People look at you different.
And as a result, she formed a tight bond with her younger sister, who was only 8.
Sonia and Priscilla were really close. They always took care of each other.
And eventually, they not only adjusted to life in Pueblo, they excelled.
They were ahead in school. They loved it.
Sonia and her sister also did well after school.
I put them in gymnastics, ballet.
But raised by a single mother, they had to help out at home.
I taught the girls to do their own laundry because I was working 2 jobs.
And that was how in 1999, 14-year-old Sonia first met Brian Swartz. 6 years older than Sonia, Brian's family had been in Pueblo for generations.
It's kind of a 6th-generation town where your great-great-grandparents grew up here and now you grew up here. And we were always going on family reunions, and there was probably between 150 to 200 of us.
In his immediate family, Brian was one of 3 brothers.
Brian and his brothers and father were close, worked on cars all the time. They were our family mechanics.
And in 1999, after graduating high school, the aspiring mechanic got his own apartment, which is where he met Sonia.
She was doing the laundry and she met Brian in the laundry room.
She apparently made quite an impression, too.
Brian came over with candy and flowers at the door and he wanted to see Sonia.
But could he win over her mother?
He's begging me to date my daughter. I told him, you're too old.
What business does a 21-year-old want with my 14-year-old sister?
I told him to stay away from her.
But despite being forbidden to see him by her mother, Sonia and Brian's relationship blossomed.
I had to work. So after school, she was meeting him that I didn't know.
She thought he was everything. He's older and has a car, and she was easily impressed with all that.
And by the time she was 15, Sonia was pregnant.
And of course, she said she was in love and she wanted to have his child.
It appeared that Brian was just as ecstatic, too.
They were very happy, very, very just excited and very loving.
And despite her family's objections, Sonia moved in with Brian.
As long as she was with Brian, nothing could faze her.
Sonia gave birth to a daughter in 2000 and dropped out of school to take care of her little girl.
Sonia let go of everything, and the baby and Brian were her priority.
And in 2002, at the age of 17, Sonia gave birth to a second daughter.
Brian was a proud father of 2 little girls, and Sonia was a mother raising her 2 children.
And despite her initial objections, Sonia's mother warmed to Brian, and after the birth of her grandchildren, gradually accepted him as part of the family.
They were very happy, I'd say, for the first 2 years. Just normal, you know. Being a couple, taking care of the babies. It was great.
They may have been happy, but the young couple did have some issues to overcome. Despite having 2 children to take care of, Brian seldom held down a regular job.
The only job I knew of Brian having was at Walmart, and he briefly worked for the newspaper.
He did earn some money as a shade tree mechanic.
My grandma had a couple cars fixed by Brian and his dad.
And at one point, Sonia had to take a part-time job to make ends meet.
I worked at Domino's Pizza. I told her, come on out and be my pizza maker.
Although since she dropped out of high school, Sonia had a hard time advancing beyond minimum wage.
She tried several times to get her GED.
But with 2 kids to raise, she struggled to make all the required classes.
She'd get those 2 steps ahead and then she'd be knocked back 3.
And at the age of 20, after getting pregnant with their 3rd child, Sonia put finishing her education on hold once more.
Sonia seemed happy about being pregnant.
Sonia had the baby, a little boy, in 2005.
Brian was over the moon. Brian was ecstatic to have his son, to carry on the last name Swartz.
According to Brian's cousin, Sonia seemed content, too.
She kind of felt like her life had become complete. She had her 2 little girls, and Brian had his little boy, and life was going to be this happy-go-lucky life from there forward.
And by the time they'd been together nearly 10 years, Sonia and Brian had built a family and seemed to be planning their future. But in reality, was their happy-go-lucky life haunted by a host of dark and deadly secrets? Coming up, the police get an anonymous call about Brian.
They felt like there might have been some foul play involved.
But is there a logical explanation for his disappearance?
It's not illegal to be missing. Some individuals don't want to be contacted.
On August 11, 2009, the police in Pueblo, Colorado received a curious call concerning Sonia Mitchell's boyfriend.
Got information that a gentleman by the name of Brian Schwartz had gone missing.
Somebody is reporting they hadn't seen Brian Schwartz for a couple, 2 or 3 weeks.
Exactly who reported the 30-year-old mechanic missing remained a mystery.
Crime Stoppers, everybody that calls in is to remain anonymous.
But the caller did say they suspected Brian hadn't just disappeared.
They felt like there might have been some foul play involved.
And when the investigators did a quick check, running Brian's name through their database, it looked as if the caller might have had a point.
He had an extensive history with the Pueblo Police Department. When I was looking into his lifestyle, he had some drug charges.
Brian's rap sheet included charges for possession of marijuana and cocaine, a few distribution arrests, and a few assault charges, though he'd never spent more than a day or two in jail. However, the fact that Brian had a record immediately had the investigators wondering, could the Crime Stoppers caller be right? Was Brian's sudden disappearance the result of foul play?
Because of his lifestyle, there's high likelihood of something bad that could have happened.
Especially since he had a history of selling drugs.
Certainly being in the narcotics business like Brian was, that's a very unpredictable lifestyle.
Or could it mean there was another explanation for his disappearance? Maybe Brian was simply laying low for some reason.
There's always the possibility that Brian doesn't want to be found.
It's not illegal to be missing. Some individuals don't want to be contacted, and it's not illegal to do that.
Or could he have gone out of town on a drug run? When the investigators ran Brian's vehicle registration, they got the first clue about his possible whereabouts, or at least the whereabouts of his van.
The van was found abandoned on I-25 south of Raton, New Mexico.
Was the abandoned van more evidence of foul play? The authorities in New Mexico didn't think so.
When I spoke with the New Mexico State Police, they said it apparently broke a fan belt and probably overheated, so it was left on the side of the road.
Brian's abandoned van appeared to be a dead end. Running the registration did give them his address, though. But when the investigators went to check it out, it wasn't Brian or Sonia Mitchell, Brian's 24-year-old girlfriend and the mother of his 3 children, who met them at the door.
When I first arrived at the house, I knocked on the door, and there was a male by the name of Eloy Varos who answered the door.
He was a friend of the family, according to what he told the investigator.
He had a girlfriend, common-law wife, and they had kids. And their kids and Sonia and Brian's kids, they would all play together.
Eloy at the time said that Sonia wasn't there, and as we were speaking, Sonia pulled up in a vehicle.
And when the investigator explained why he was there, that someone had called Crime Stoppers to report Brian missing, Sonia said that was more or less true.
She says that they had gotten into an argument a couple weeks prior to that, and he loaded up a bunch of his stuff in his van and left.
According to Sonia, she hadn't heard from Brian since, and she said that was just fine with her. And his drug dealing wasn't the only reason she was glad he was gone.
She tells me that they did not have a good relationship. There was a lot of domestic violence.
She spelled out some pretty horrific treatment from Brian. At one point, she told us that he had started choking her out and was telling her that he was going to kill her. Then he stopped choking her right when she was about ready to pass out. She said that he looked at her and told her he didn't want to kill her by choking her because when people die like that, they defecate on themselves and they vomit, and he didn't want to have to clean up all her mess.
But if Brian had done such terrible things, could that mean Sonia had something to do with his disappearance?
She reassured me that she still loved him and she would never hurt him.
For the moment, at least until they could verify her claims, the investigators didn't see any reason not to believe her.
I didn't feel like Sonia was overly nervous or anxious by any means. That's why I took what she told me as being truthful.
And when the investigators spoke to Brian's father, he didn't seem all that worried about his son being missing either.
According to the father, he would go missing for weeks at a time.
In fact, according to his father, Sonia wasn't the only one who'd parted with Brian on bad terms.
He tells me that the last time he had seen Brian, they had gotten into an argument, a fairly heated argument about a vehicle that they co-owned together. And I guess Brian had gotten upset and mad and left and hasn't spoke with them since.
Alongside what Sonia had already told them, his father's story had the investigators wondering whether Brian was missing at all.
With those two stories, that it sounds like that Brian's just not getting along with a lot of people in his life, and maybe he did choose to put some distance between himself and the people that he seemed to be having rocky relationships with.
And both stories seemed to fit what the investigators already knew about Brian.
He had a history. There was some drug dealing history. He was a violent person.
His volatile past and previous run-ins with the law might have tempted the authorities to simply stop looking into Brian's disappearance.
It's not something that you're going to call out the troops and start searching a grid search somewhere for him.
But there was still that nagging possibility of foul play.
It heightened our awareness a little bit more about the case.
Therefore, the investigators made one final attempt to track down Brian's whereabouts via his cell phone records.
Selling illegal drugs, they rely heavily on their phones for their business.
And if Brian was still using his phone, it offered the police a chance to find him.
Cell phone data could not necessarily get an exact location, but you could find a particular cell tower was essentially sort of transmitting data to a particular phone, and based on that tower, you could kind of estimate the location of a particular call.
When the investigators pulled Brian's phone records, it revealed what they expected. The small-time drug dealer all but lived on his phone.
The biggest thing that really stood out to me, there was hundreds and hundreds of hours of use.
Right up to July 27th, approximately 2 weeks before the Crime Stoppers call that kicked off the missing persons case.
From that day on, all that activity stops. That's a huge red flag.
One that sent a loud and clear signal to the investigators.
At that point, we suspected it was a homicide case.
Coming up, Sonia changes her story.
He's in trouble and he needs some money.
And the investigators make a gruesome discovery.
Decomposition is consistent with somebody who hasn't been seen for a month.
By August 27, 2009, it had been more than 2 weeks since the Pueblo, Colorado Police Department had received an anonymous Crime Stoppers call reporting 30-year-old Brian Swartz missing.
We talked to his father, who said he hadn't heard from him for a few weeks.
And Brian's girlfriend, 24-year-old Sonia Mitchell, said she hadn't seen him either, not since he'd stormed out during an argument.
It appears that him and Sonia had a very rocky relationship. Because there was many reports of domestic violence type calls.
The rocky relationship could have given Brian a reason to simply leave. But the investigators were starting to wonder if there might be another explanation for why he had apparently abandoned his van and stopped using his phone.
We began to kind of think, well, maybe foul play was involved.
But if so, was Brian's criminal activity to blame?
Brian Swartz apparently made his living by selling drugs. He was selling anything from marijuana to cocaine and using the products himself.
Or could his alleged abuse of Sonia have something to do with it?
Anytime you hear that kind of activity, there could be some motivation for maybe some retaliation.
So that's one of the first things that comes to your mind is, all right, there's some sort of abused spouse or battered woman syndrome.
Not that Sonia had given any indication she might have had anything to do with Brian's disappearance when police questioned her at her house. And when she dropped by the police department on August 27th, she seemed genuinely concerned about him.
She started off by asking me if I had heard from Brian, and I told her I hadn't.
And that's when Sonia dropped a bombshell.
She had said, well, look, I hadn't been 100% honest with you.
According to Sonia, what she told them earlier about Brian leaving after an argument wasn't true, because she'd been reluctant to tell the police what Brian had really been up to.
She then goes into telling me how Brian makes runs to Mexico, picking up drugs, bringing them back to Pueblo and selling them.
And on his latest trip, according to Sonia, Brian had gotten into a serious jam.
She receives a call from him saying that he's in trouble and he needs some money.
There was a big narcotics transaction taking place, and he'd messed that deal up. So he was into these guys for some money.
Sonia said that she tried to round up some cash, but couldn't. And a few days later, Brian had come home, escorted by 4 henchmen of the drug dealer he owed money.
Sonia told us that 4 Mexican nationals showed up at their house, that Brian loaded some of his personal property in his van.
A gun safe that contained several firearms, a large screen TV, some tools, some kind of a refrigerator that she called it a kegerator.
And then, once all the loot had been loaded up, Brian and the drug dealer's henchmen had driven off.
She said that was the last time she'd seen him.
It was a frightening story, but was it true?
His drug dealing background lent a little credence to her story.
And so did the fact that his van had been found ditched along the road between Pueblo and Mexico.
Makes sense. It might have been in transit down there, or they may have taken Brian down there.
But when the investigators, hoping to get some clues about the drug dealer's henchmen, went back and spoke to Brian and Sonia's neighbors, one neighbor had seen something quite similar to what Sonia described.
She'd seen, I believe, a black Ford Bronco a number of days prior, pulling up with a number of people loading what appeared to be just personal items, to include TV and a large gun safe, into this Ford Bronco and then drive off.
However, according to the neighbor, Brian was nowhere to be seen.
The neighbor says, well, I saw Sonia and some other people loading these items.
And that wasn't all the neighbor had seen either. It turned out that Sonia hadn't been lying when she said Brian had disappeared after a fight.
One of the last times that they had seen Brian, they witnessed Brian and Sonia in a argument, screaming match out in the street, and then it turned physical. Brian was dragging Sonia back to the house by her hair.
That kind of piqued everybody's interest. Maybe, she had done something, self-defense, or something had happened.
But it was a few days later, on September 2nd, when the investigators tried to get back in touch with Sonia, that things really got interesting.
She had moved out of the house.
She had apparently left in a hurry, too.
The cupboards were open. There were, canned goods on the counter. There was clothes thrown about. It's like they were gone, in the middle of the night, and just out the door they went.
The fact that Sonia appeared to be on the run gave new urgency to the investigation into Brian's disappearance. But then, on September 5th, a call to the Pueblo County Sheriff's Office would move the investigation into a disturbing new direction. The call came from a retired wildlife officer who'd been out hunting that morning and stumbled onto a gruesome discovery.
They found possibly human remains buried in rural western Pueblo County.
The remains were badly decomposed, but sheriff's investigators were able to tentatively identify the gender of the deceased.
We were able to determine he was potentially a male.
And hoping for a lead on the dead man's identity, the sheriff's investigators started reaching out to area law enforcement.
You immediately begin looking at missing persons.
which eventually led them to the investigator looking into Brian Swartz's disappearance.
Lieutenant Don Leach contacted me and told me about some remains that were found in a rural area west of Pueblo.
But was it Brian? Hoping for confirmation, the sheriff's investigators brought in a forensic anthropologist to examine the remains.
The decomposition pattern is consistent with somebody who hasn't been seen for a month.
And whoever the dead man was, it appeared that he had been murdered.
There are some peculiar blunt trauma pattern injuries on this cranium. There were 3 impacts that I could identify. There were 2 on the front of the face, and there was 1 just behind the ear.
And when it came to identifying the corpse, the investigators got lucky.
On his hand, there was enough skin that they could get a fingerprint, and they were able to identify the remains as Brian.
5 weeks after he disappeared, the search for Brian had become a homicide investigation.
So obviously Sonia is a potential suspect.
But where was she? Word on the street was that to find her, the police should track down 29-year-old Eloy Varos. A so-called family friend, he'd answered Sonia's door back in August when the police first went looking for Brian.
We've been told they're spending a lot of time together, even to the point that they're living together.
And that left the investigators wondering, was it a new relationship? Or did it have something to do with Brian's death?
When we dug into Brian Swartz's life, we could tell he was a very jealous person, very violent person, not somebody that would put up with another man possibly being with the mother of his children.
Whatever had happened, the investigators were anxious to talk to Eloy, and they would get their chance on September 14th.
He walks into the police department, wanted to talk about the case.
Obviously, the word got out to Eloy that the police were looking for him.
Once Eloy sat down with the investigators, he claimed that he had nothing to hide, opening up about how he knew Brian Swartz.
Eloy even went as far as to tell us that he would help Brian with his narcotics business.
Brian would bring the loads of marijuana to Pueblo, and Eloy Varos helped him sell the marijuana.
However, Eloy also admitted that he'd gotten more than a little extra cash out of the deal.
Him and Sonia were having sexual relations when Brian was making these narcotics trips to Texas. He was living with Sonia while Brian was gone, and then as soon as Brian would show back up, Eloy's out of the picture.
They just had a love triangle, and Eloy ended up falling for Sonia a little bit more than anybody just messing around with somebody, just a one-time thing, you know what I mean? So he ended up with Sonia.
He wanted to take care of her. He really genuinely cared for her.
And he told the investigators that Brian treated her horribly.
He was a witness to the abuse. He was definitely a witness to the violence that Brian was prone to.
However, he denied having anything to do with Brian's death.
I think he's trying to outsmart us and outthink us, and he's trying to put himself in a position to not get in trouble.
I think he was trying to, in some ways, try to protect Sonia by explaining the violence that Brian was capable of and the violence that he had witnessed.
But if he was trying to protect Sonia and himself, Eloy may have made a serious mistake. At one point in the interview, he made a passing reference to something that immediately caught the investigators' attention.
He gave us a piece of information that, frankly, ended up, making this case just basically turn upside down.
He told us that he had rented a storage unit and that Sonia had stored some of her property in there.
That was one of those aha moments that, every detective wishes for, and we got it from Eloy.
Because when the investigators got a search warrant for the storage unit, they made a surprising discovery.
Items that she tells us that he had taken with him with the Mexican nationals.
However, the tools, TVs, and other valuables the drug dealer's henchmen had allegedly taken weren't even the most damning thing the investigators found.
We opened up the storage unit and I pulled a mattress out, and there it was. Right on this mattress was just this stain of blood and tissue and bone.
Coming up, Sonia's arrest leads to a tense standoff.
All the cops came, their guns were drawn.
And she makes a startling confession.
I can't live like this no more.
On September 14th, 2009, 9 days after finding Sonia Mitchell's boyfriend Brian Swartz buried in a shallow grave outside of town, the Pueblo, Colorado police made a major breakthrough in the case, one that came courtesy of Sonia's lover, Eloy Varos.
It's kind of this weird love triangle going on there.
During an interview with the police, Eloy had accidentally mentioned that he'd rented a storage unit for Sonia.
It wasn't his intention. I think he slipped up. And to be honest, I don't even know that he understood until it was all said and done what exactly he had told us.
They went into the storage shed and searched it, and they found a mattress that appeared to have a large blood stain on it.
As soon as we saw that, we were like, wow.
And the day after finding the mattress, the investigators went to Brian and Sonia's house with another search warrant and a chemical called luminol.
Luminol is used to detect blood that's not necessarily visible to the naked eye.
It will even reveal where blood has been cleaned up. And when the investigators sprayed the chemical in Sonia and Brian's bedroom, the results were astonishing.
We also found what's called cast-off blood on the ceiling.
Something very violent had happened in that house.
The bloody ceiling, coupled with the bloody mattress from the storage unit, led the investigators to an inescapable conclusion.
Obviously, that was the murder scene.
And from there, the investigators moved quickly to take Sonia and Eloy, who'd rented the storage unit, into custody.
Once we find the blood in the house, arrest warrants go out.
But could the investigators find them? It had been almost 2 weeks since Sonia and Eloy had moved out of her house and gone into hiding.
When they left that house, they left in a hurry.
So it was a welcome surprise when shortly after the judge signed her arrest warrant, Sonia and her mother showed up at the storage unit, totally unaware that the police had just searched it.
Obviously, they were there to remove the stuff that was in the storage unit.
While we were getting into the garage, that's when all the cops came, the detectives, their guns were drawn. I was in shock. I didn't know what was going on. They put Sonia in the car, and she was just staring at me and praying. And she told the detectives, "Take the handcuffs off my mom. She had nothing to do with it."
Sonia had a look of resignation on her face and said that she wanted to talk and tell us the truth about what happened. And she didn't want anybody else to get in trouble.
Taken into custody and brought in for questioning, Sonia didn't deny killing Brian.
She told us that, of course, the story about the Mexican nationals was absolutely not true.
But mostly, she wanted to talk about the abuse she'd suffered over the years.
Done the whole thing. He was like beating me up every day for it, every day, no matter what I did.
One incident in particular that stands out is he laid out some plastic on the floor of the house, stripped her of her clothes, and so she was naked on this plastic. And he poured some type of accelerant on her.
All over the top of my head and told me he was going to set me on fire.
That level of violence, and it was crazy to hear her talk about that.
And yet she never left Brian, who she'd been with since the age of 14.
I loved him so much. I just begged him to be normal, and not to hit me, and not to do drugs, and to be normal.
He would tell her he would, and then he would go back to the old violent Brian.
Everybody always asks me, why don't you get help? Why don't you go to the cops?
He'd been charged with domestic violence before. Nothing had ever happened. Law enforcement, in her mind, they hadn't done anything to protect her from Brian.
In fact, as Sonia pointed out, the police couldn't even make drug charges stick.
Nobody could touch him. He had a giant record and just did whatever he wanted all of the time.
Sonia said she hadn't considered running away an option either.
And he was always all, I'll kill your family, I'll kill your sister, I'll kill your mom. And I thought even if I ran away and he goes psycho and does kill my mom, how could I live with that? Right?
So according to Sonia, she'd suffered in silence for years.
I can understand how Sonia was so demoralized and mentally abused, physically abused, and just dominated by Brian.
Eventually, though, the discussion turned to the beginning of August 2009.
She said that on the night that he died, Brian was in a particularly foul mood. He told her that he wanted to have sex, and she didn't want to have sex.
I was like, no, get away from me. I don't want to be with him. He raped me.
She said that once that whole episode of violence was over, he took a bunch of pills and he went to sleep.
Sonia didn't sleep, however. Instead, she told the police that Brian's brutal rape had been a wake-up call.
I think I said, you know what? I can't live like this no more.
Once Brian had passed out, she tells us that she knew that was her opportunity.
I snapped, sir. I don't know what to tell you. Let me rape you and then see what you do.
According to Sonia, while Brian was passed out, she'd picked up the heaviest thing she could find.
Sonia said that she used a weight bar to beat Brian.
I hit him real hard once, and he was moving, but like he wasn't up. So I hit him again and again. He didn't move no more.
Sonia said that Brian's death had sent her into shock.
I couldn't believe it. I kept waiting for him to get up and to get me, and he didn't. I thought it was like fake, like it wasn't really happening. You know what I mean?
She kind of described to us that it almost felt like she wasn't there. Like it was in a fog or a dream, or she didn't really believe it was taking place.
But eventually, the fact that Brian was really dead had sunk in, leaving Sonia in a dilemma.
I didn't know what to do. So I found like the biggest thing I had.
It was a large plastic storage tub, according to Sonia.
I pulled him off the bed and I put him in it and I stuffed him in there.
Then she said that she dragged the storage container into the back of the van and drove it out to the edge of town.
I just pulled over and I started digging and I got tired, so I just stopped and I just threw him in there and covered him up and walked away.
Sonia said she was also the one who ditched Brian's van along the roadside in New Mexico.
I drove it by myself and I drove it, but it broke. Something broke and started smoking. I hitchhiked my way back.
And once back in Pueblo, Sonia said she'd come up with the story about Brian and the Mexican drug dealers in order to cover her tracks.
Right away from the very beginning, everybody believed me. Everybody believed me because he had been doing the drug trafficking for so long.
And Eloy, did he have anything to do with the murder? According to Sonia, the only thing he'd done was help her move Brian's things into storage.
Well, Eloy tell us he helped you get rid of Brian?
No, sir. Because he didn't. Nobody helped me.
And while the investigators were moved by what she had been through, they doubted that part of her story, that she had acted alone, was true.
Miss Mitchell was a slight woman, I think 5'5", maybe 120 pounds. Mr. Schwartz was a pretty big guy, 6'5", 2+.
I still had kind of in the back of my mind that, maybe Eloy was involved as well.
But for the moment, Sonia's confession was more than enough to charge her with murder.
To be able to take her statement, match it up with what we were seeing at the crime scene and the stuff we recovered from the storage unit was good for us. It was perfect.
But one question remained. What would a jury make of Sonia's heartbreaking confession? Coming up, Sonia tells her story in court.
There was things I was shocked to hear about.
But will sympathy for what she endured be enough to sway the outcome?
Murder was committed. We can't just look the other way.
By August 5th, 2011, it had been almost 2 years since Sonia Mitchell admitted to killing her boyfriend, Brian Schwartz.
She had been physically assaulted and then sexually assaulted by Mr. Schwartz. And as he was sleeping, essentially just bludgeoned him to death.
However, contrary to her confession, Sonia hadn't acted entirely alone. Questioned after Sonia's arrest, her sister Priscilla told police that she, her husband Perry, and Sonia's lover Eloy Varos had all helped dispose of the body.
Sonia confided in Priscilla, and Eloy, Perry, and Sonia end up going over to the house. They do put Brian's body in this tote, like Sonia described.
And by August of 2011, all three had pleaded guilty to accessory to murder charges, and all but Priscilla received 3-year sentences.
Priscilla, in exchange for what she had told us, we gave her a sentence of probation.
But what would Sonia's confession end up costing her?
The first-degree murder can carry a life sentence.
Taking Sonia's case to trial could be risky, though, considering the circumstances.
Sonia exhibited all the signs of a battered spouse.
So in 2011, the prosecutors had offered Sonia a deal,
She agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder.
which left the 26-year-old mother of 3 facing anywhere from 10 to 30 years in prison.
The sentence was essentially left open to the court, or the judge.
And at her sentencing hearing on August 5th, Sonia made a plea for leniency.
She could present her side of the story, essentially offer witnesses and testimony to the nature of her and Brian Schwartz's relationship.
There was a few things I had heard and a few things I was shocked to hear about.
Some of the incidents of abuse that Sonia described were sickening.
The most heartbreaking one. As he was asking her questions, he would heat this knife up. And if she responded with the wrong answer, that knife went against her back.
And she had the scars to prove it.
I never knew until she stood up in court and showed up.
It's obvious she's a long-time victim of abuse.
Which in the end did stay the judge's hand, at least somewhat.
The court imposed a sentence of 20 years for the charge of second-degree murder.
20 years was a bitter disappointment for Sonia's family.
It was either him or her. That's how she felt. She felt like he was really going to kill her, like she had nowhere to go.
Sonia had been through a lot. It should have been a lesser sentence for Sonia, especially with all that abuse.
Perhaps, although the prosecutors disagree.
We all sympathize with what she went through, but at the end of the day, murder was committed. We can't just look the other way on that. Had she just come forward after it happened, obviously she wouldn't have necessarily gotten off, but I think things would have been different for her.
The envelope had been untouched for 37 years, hidden inside an old evidence room, buried beneath thousands of forgotten files. A thin paper folder carrying a name that had once shaken an entire Kansas community. A name that slowly disappeared from newspapers. A name that became nothing more than a cold case number. Until one investigator opened the file again. And inside that forgotten folder was something nobody expected to find. A photograph. A fingerprint. And a clue that had been sitting in silence since 1989. For decades, the town of Willow Creek, Kansas, carried the memory of a woman who vanished without warning. Her name was Rachel Monroe. She was 29 years old. A young woman with a stable job, a close family, and a future she had carefully built. People who knew Rachel described her as dependable. The kind of person who always answered calls. The kind of person who never disappeared without telling someone. But on the night of March 14th, 1989, Rachel Monroe walked out of a small neighborhood restaurant and was never seen alive again. The case became one of the darkest mysteries in the history of the town. A disappearance with almost no answers. No obvious suspect. No clear motive. Only fragments. A missing car. A strange phone call. A witness who remembered something unusual. And one tiny piece of evidence that investigators did not understand until decades later. The night Rachel disappeared began like any other. Willow Creek was a quiet Kansas community. A place where people knew their neighbors. A place where familiar faces appeared everywhere. The streets were calm. The businesses closed early. The kind of town where crime stories usually belong somewhere else. Not there. Not in their neighborhood. Rachel Monroe had lived there for almost her entire life. She worked as an administrative assistant at a local insurance company. She volunteered at a community shelter. She was known for remembering birthdays, helping coworkers, and checking on elderly neighbors. Nothing about her suggested she wanted to leave. Nothing about her suggested she was running away. And that was why her disappearance shocked everyone. On March 14th, Rachel finished work at 5:30 p.m. Several co-workers remembered seeing her leave the office. She smiled. She said goodbye. She mentioned plans for the weekend. A completely ordinary moment. A moment nobody realized would become the final confirmed sighting of her. Later that evening, Rachel met a friend at a small restaurant downtown. Security cameras did not exist in the area at that time. There was no digital trail, no phone location data, no modern technology to reconstruct her final hours. Only human memory. And human memory can fade. At approximately 8:15 p.m., Rachel left the restaurant. Her friend remembered Rachel saying she was going home. She walked toward the parking lot. She unlocked her vehicle. She waved goodbye. And then she disappeared. The next morning, Rachel's employer noticed something unusual. She never arrived. At first, nobody panicked. People assumed she was sick. Maybe her alarm failed. Maybe her car had problems. But as the hours passed, concern grew. Rachel's family called her apartment. No answer. They contacted hospitals. Nothing. They checked with friends. Nobody had heard from her. By evening, police officers entered Rachel's apartment. And what they found created the first mystery. The apartment looked normal, almost untouched. Her purse was there. Her wallet was there. Her clothing remained inside the closet. Her calendar was open on the kitchen table. Everything suggested Rachel planned to return. But one thing was missing. Her keys. Her car keys. The same keys that should have been with her when she left the restaurant. Investigators searched the apartment. They found no obvious signs of violence. No broken windows. No overturned furniture. No evidence of a struggle. But near the front entrance, detectives noticed something strange. A small mark on the doorframe. A fin impression. Almost invisible. At the time, it seemed meaningless. A scratch. A normal imperfection. Another detail in a case full of unanswered questions. Nobody knew that decades later, that tiny mark would become one of the most important clues in the investigation. The first search for Rachel began immediately. Police questioned friends, family members, co-workers, anyone who had contact with her. The questions were simple. Did Rachel seem afraid? Was she planning to leave? Did she have enemies? Did anyone make her uncomfortable? The answers were almost always the same. No. Rachel was happy. Rachel was stable. Rachel had no reason to disappear. But investigators discovered something unusual. 3 days before Rachel vanished, she had reported receiving strange phone calls. The caller never spoke. Only silence. Then the line would go dead. Rachel mentioned it to a coworker. She laughed about it. She assumed someone was playing a prank. But after she disappeared, those calls became something else. A warning. A possible sign that someone had been watching her. The investigation expanded. Police searched the area around the restaurant. They examined roads, parking lots, nearby buildings. And then they found Rachel's car, abandoned less than 5 miles away. The vehicle was locked. Nothing inside appeared stolen. Her personal belongings remained untouched. But investigators noticed something disturbing. The driver's seat was pushed back. Not how Rachel usually positioned it. And on the passenger side door handle, a fingerprint. A partial fingerprint. At the time, it meant almost nothing. There was no national database capable of identifying it. No technology that could connect it to a person instantly. It was collected, photographed, placed into evidence, then forgotten. For years, the case slowly went cold. The media attention faded. The searches stopped. The detectives moved on to other investigations. Rachel Monroe became another unsolved mystery. A photograph on a missing person poster. A name in an old file. A question without an answer. But Rachel's family never stopped searching. Her mother kept every newspaper article, every police update, every piece of information. She believed someone knew the truth. And she believed that one day, something would bring that truth back. She was right, because 37 years later, a A new detective reviewing old cold cases noticed something unusual. The file had never been fully re-examined with modern forensic methods. The evidence was still preserved. The fingerprint was still there. And when investigators entered that old print into a modern database, the system produced a result. A name. A match. A connection that sent shockwaves through the department. Because the fingerprint did not belong to a stranger. It belonged to someone who had been questioned in 1989. Someone who had been close to the investigation. Someone whose name had appeared in the original reports. But somehow had never become a suspect. The Kansas 1989 cold case was no longer frozen. The mystery was moving again. And the new discovery was about to expose a truth that had been hidden for nearly 4 decades. Because the person who left that fingerprint behind had never truly disappeared. They had simply been waiting for someone to find them. The fingerprint match changed the entire investigation. For 37 years, Rachel Monroe's disappearance had existed in the darkest corner of the police archives. A case that frustrated detectives. A case that haunted her family. A case where every possible lead eventually collapsed into silence. But now, one forgotten fingerprint had reopened everything. The past had returned. And with it came a name investigators had not expected. Michael Voss. In 1989, Michael was 34 years old. He lived in Willow Creek. He worked as an appliance repair technician, a job that gave him access to homes, buildings, and private spaces throughout the community. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about him. No violent criminal history. No major arrests. No obvious reason for police to consider him dangerous. He was quiet. Polite. The type of person most people overlooked. But when detectives pulled his name from the original case file, they discovered something disturbing. Michael Voss had already been interviewed during the first investigation. He was not a new suspect discovered through technology. He had been there from the beginning. He had answered questions. He had spoken with detectives. And somehow, he had disappeared from the investigation. The new team immediately reviewed his original statement from 1989. The interview was only a few pages long. At the time, it seemed routine. Michael told investigators he knew Rachel because he had repaired an appliance in her apartment several months earlier. He said they were not friends. He said they rarely spoke. He claimed he had no idea where she was on the night she disappeared. The original detectives accepted his statement. There was no evidence contradicting him. No reason to believe he was involved. But 40 years later, investigators noticed something different. A detail hidden inside the old interview. A sentence Michael had said that seemed insignificant in 1989. But now it stood out. When detectives asked him about Rachel's apartment, Michael described the front entrance. The location of the hallway. The position of the door. The exact area where her keys were usually kept. The problem was simple. Michael should not have known those details. At least, not according to his own story. He claimed he had only been inside once. For a repair call. A short visit. Nothing more. But his description suggested familiarity. Too much familiarity. The new investigators began rebuilding the timeline. They did not start with theories. They started with facts. They looked at every person connected to Rachel. Every conversation. Every movement. Every overlooked detail. And slowly, the case began to reveal a pattern. Michael Voss had been closer to Rachel than anyone realized. The first discovery came from old employment records. 3 weeks before Rachel disappeared, Michael had performed a repair at her apartment building. Not just once. Twice. The second visit had never been mentioned during the original investigation. Michael had told police he visited the building only one time. Another inconsistency. Another unexplained detail. Detectives searched deeper. They discovered that Michael had also worked on several properties owned by Rachel's neighbors. He knew the building. He knew the residents. He knew the routines. He understood when people were home. And when they were not. The investigators returned to Rachel's abandoned vehicle. The fingerprint found on the passenger side door handle became the center of attention. For years, it had been considered useless. But modern analysis showed something important. The print was not damaged. It was clear. Complete enough for identification. And now it had a name attached. Michael Voss. But detectives still needed to answer one critical question. Why was his fingerprint there? Michael had an explanation. When investigators contacted him, he admitted he had touched Rachel's car before. But only once. He claimed Rachel asked him to look at a problem with the vehicle shortly before she disappeared. A simple mechanical issue. Nothing suspicious. But investigators checked the records. There was no repair request. No appointment. No note. No witness confirming the story. Another explanation that created more questions. The interview became tense. Detectives asked why he never mentioned this during the original investigation. Michael said he forgot. A statement that immediately raised suspicion. Because people forget ordinary moments. They forget small conversations. They forget meaningless details. But investigators believed Michael had forgotten something much more important. A connection to a missing woman. The investigation continued. Detectives searched through old witness statements. And one name appeared repeatedly. A neighbor named Karen Ellis. In 1989, Karen lived across from Rachel. She had told police she saw Rachel's car leaving the neighborhood on the night she disappeared. But she was never certain who was driving. At the time, detectives focused on the vehicle, not the person behind the wheel. Now, decades later, investigators returned to Karen. They asked the same question. What exactly did she see? Her answer changed everything. Karen said she remembered something she had never included in her original statement. A second person was inside the car. She could not see the face, but she remembered the silhouette. A man sitting in the driver's seat. Rachel's car. Leaving late at night. With someone else behind the wheel. The original investigation had missed the significance. Because everyone assumed Rachel was the one driving. But Karen's memory suggested something else. Rachel may not have left voluntarily. Someone may have taken control of her car. Someone may have taken control of the situation. The detectives returned to Michael Voss. This time, they examined his life after 1989. And they found something unusual. Shortly after Rachel disappeared, Michael left Kansas. He moved to another state. He changed jobs. He stopped contacting many people from Willow Creek. The timing was suspicious. But not enough. People move. People change careers. People start over. Investigators knew they needed more. Then came another discovery. A box of old photographs found in a storage facility connected to Michael. Inside were pictures from his time in Willow Creek. Most were ordinary. Family gatherings. Work events. Old homes. But one photograph stopped investigators immediately. Rachel Monroe. Standing outside her apartment building. Taken days before she disappeared. The photograph had never been released publicly. The question was obvious. How did Michael get it? And why did he keep it for nearly 4 decades? The discovery sent investigators back to the beginning. Because suddenly, Rachel's disappearance no longer looked like a random crime. It looked personal. Someone had been watching her. Someone had been collecting pieces of her life. Someone had been closer than anyone understood. The evidence was growing. The fingerprint. The hidden photograph. The changing stories. The forgotten repair visits. The witness who saw another person in Rachel's car. Everything pointed toward one possibility. Michael Voss was not simply connected to Rachel's disappearance. He may have been the person who knew exactly what happened. But before investigators could move forward, they discovered one more shocking detail. A hidden report from 1989. A report that had never been included in the official case summary. A report involving Rachel herself. Because days before she vanished, Rachel had tried to tell someone she was afraid. And the person she mentioned was the same man whose fingerprint had just reopened the case. Michael Voss. The hidden report changed the direction of the entire investigation. For 37 years, detectives believed Rachel Monroe vanished without warning. A woman who disappeared. A car left behind. A case that slowly faded into silence. But the forgotten document revealed something investigators had never fully understood. Rachel was afraid. And before she disappeared, she tried to tell someone. The report came from a small police contact log dated 5 days before Rachel vanished. It was not an official complaint. Not an arrest report. Not a major piece of evidence. Just a short note written by an officer who answered a phone call. A note that had been buried inside thousands of pages of paperwork. The message was simple. Female caller concerned about repeated unwanted contact. No name. No detailed description. No follow-up. In 1989, it seemed like nothing. A minor issue. A possible misunderstanding. But when investigators looked closer decades later, they found something shocking. The caller was Rachel Monroe, and the person she was worried about was Michael Voss, the same man whose fingerprint was discovered on her abandoned vehicle, the same man who claimed he barely knew her, the same man who had spent nearly 40 years outside the center of the investigation. Suddenly, every forgotten detail became important. The strange phone calls, the feeling of being watched, the unexpected appearances, the photograph, the fingerprint. The case was no longer about a missing woman with no clues. It was about a woman who had been trying to warn people. Investigators contacted the officer who originally took the call, but he had retired years earlier. His memory was incomplete. He remembered receiving a complaint. He remembered Rachel sounding uncomfortable, but he did not remember the details. However, the old records revealed something else. The call was made late in the evening. Rachel had not called because of a single incident. She had called because something had been happening repeatedly. Someone had been entering her life without permission. Someone had been crossing boundaries. And now detectives had to ask the question that haunted the entire investigation. Why did nobody connect Michael Voss to Rachel's fear in 1989? The answer was painfully simple. The information was separated. Different reports. Different officers. Different pieces of a puzzle that nobody put together. The warning existed. The fingerprint existed. The witness existed. But they were all trapped in different corners of the investigation. Until decades later, the new detectives began examining Michael's relationship with Rachel. They discovered that the connection between them was much deeper than Michael admitted. According to co-workers and neighbors, Michael had become increasingly interested in Rachel months before she disappeared. At first, people described it as harmless. A man showing interest. Someone trying to be friendly. But Rachel saw it differently. She told friends that Michael appeared everywhere. At the grocery store. Near her workplace. Around her apartment building. Always with an explanation. Always with a reason. But always there. One co-worker remembered a conversation that had never been included in the original investigation. Rachel had told her she felt uncomfortable because Michael seemed to know things he should not know. Her schedule. Her weekend plans. Her routines. The coworker assumed Rachel was simply annoyed. She never imagined it would become evidence in a decades-old murder investigation. The detectives now rebuilt the weeks before Rachel disappeared. And the picture became darker. Michael's behavior had escalated. The attention became pressure. The appearances became more frequent. The boundaries became smaller. Then Rachel vanished. The timeline was becoming clearer. But investigators still needed to understand what happened on the final night. They returned to the restaurant where Rachel was last seen. The building had changed. The original owners were gone. The old parking lot had been redesigned. But one witness remained. A former employee named Thomas Keller. In 1989, Thomas worked the evening shift. He remembered Rachel. He remembered seeing her leave. But he also remembered something strange. A man waiting outside. Not approaching her. Not speaking to her. Just watching. At the time, Thomas thought nothing of it. People wait outside restaurants all the time. But when detectives showed him a photograph of Michael Voss, his reaction was immediate. He recognized him. He said Michael had been there that night, standing near the parking lot, watching Rachel. The memory had remained buried for decades. Another forgotten detail. Another piece returning. Investigators now believed Michael had been following Rachel before she disappeared. But there was still one major problem. They had no direct evidence proving what happened after she left. No video. No confession. No eyewitness to an attack. Only a chain of circumstances. Strong circumstances. But circumstances. The search for physical evidence continued. Detectives examined everything connected to Michael's life after 1989. Old homes. Storage units. Vehículos. Employment records. They wanted something that connected him directly to Rachel's final moments. Then they found something unexpected. A handwritten notebook. Recovered from an old storage box. At first, it looked meaningless. Pages of dates. Short phrases. Random observations. But investigators noticed a pattern. Several entries mentioned Rachel. Not by full name. Just a single letter. Er. The entries appeared around the time before her disappearance. One sentence immediately caught attention. Soon she will understand. Investigators froze. Was it a threat? A confession? Or something meaningless taken out of context? The defense would later argue it meant nothing. But investigators believed it revealed something important. Michael had been documenting Rachel's life. Watching. Recording. Keeping information. The same behavior Rachel had feared. The same behavior she tried to report. The case was moving faster. But detectives knew the biggest challenge remained. Finding the final connection. The one piece that would transform suspicion into certainty. And then, while reviewing the original evidence inventory, investigators discovered something nobody expected. An item collected from Rachel's car in 1989. An item that had been stored for decades. Never tested. Never examined with modern technology. A small object that had been sitting unnoticed. Waiting. Because inside that old evidence box was a clue that could finally reveal what happened on the night Rachel Monroe disappeared. And when forensic experts opened the package again, they discovered something that shocked everyone involved. A trace of DNA. A trace that did not belong to Rachel. A trace that did not belong to her family. A trace connected to the man whose fingerprint had already reopened the case. Michael Voss. The cold case was no longer just a mystery. It was becoming an accusation. And after 37 years of silence, the truth was finally beginning to surface. The DNA discovery changed everything. For decades, the case of Rachel Monroe existed in a dangerous space between suspicion and uncertainty. Investigators had questions. They had theories. They had pieces of a story. But they never had the one thing every cold case investigation desperately needs. A direct connection. Now they had one. A biological trace recovered from Rachel's abandoned vehicle. A piece of evidence collected in 1989. A piece of evidence nobody understood. A piece of evidence that had waited almost 4 decades for technology to catch up. And the result sent shockwaves through the investigation. The DNA belonged to Michael Voss. The same man whose fingerprint had been found on the passenger side door handle. The same man who claimed he barely knew Rachel. The same man who insisted he had nothing to do with her disappearance. Suddenly, investigators were no longer looking at a forgotten suspect. They were looking at the last person connected to the physical evidence left behind. But the discovery created another question. What exactly happened inside Rachel's car that night? Because evidence could reveal presence. It could reveal connection. But it could not tell the entire story. Investigators needed to reconstruct those final moments. The hours between Rachel leaving the restaurant and her vehicle being discovered abandoned 5 miles away. The timeline became the center of the case. March 14, 1989. 5:30 p.m. Rachel leaves work. She appears calm. Normal. Nothing suggests danger. 7:45 p.m. Rachel arrives at the restaurant. She talks with a friend. She laughs. She makes plans for the future. 8:15 p.m. She walks toward her car. A witness sees another person nearby. A man. Watching. 8:20 p.m. Rachel's car leaves the parking lot. But investigators now believe Rachel may not be the one driving. And somewhere after that moment, everything changes. The vehicle is abandoned. Rachel disappears. And Michael Voss begins a 40-year journey of silence. Detectives return to Michael's original statement from 1989. The interview that once seemed ordinary now looked completely different. They focused on every word, every pause, every explanation. And they found something troubling. Michael had known details about Rachel's disappearance before those details were publicly released. During his original interview, he mentioned that Rachel's car had been found near an abandoned industrial road. But that information had not yet been released to the public. At the time, detectives overlooked it. They assumed he heard it from someone else. But decades later, investigators asked a different question. How did Michael know? The answer created another crack in his story. The new investigation revealed that Michael had visited the area where Rachel's car was found. Not once. Several times. Records from a nearby business showed his vehicle passing through the area shortly after Rachel disappeared. Another piece. Another connection. Another reason to look closer. Michael was questioned again. This time, detectives approached him differently. They did not ask what happened. They asked about details only the person responsible would know. They asked about Rachel's car. They asked about the evidence. They asked about the DNA. Michael remained calm. He denied involvement. He said the DNA result was impossible. He claimed investigators were trying to force a conclusion after decades of failure. Then detectives asked him one question. If you had nothing to do with Rachel's disappearance, why does every new discovery lead back to you? For the first time, Michael had no immediate answer. The silence lasted several seconds. A moment investigators would later describe as significant. Because after 37 years, the story Michael had repeated for decades was beginning to collapse. But investigators still needed to understand motive. Why Rachel? Why that night? Why would someone go from watching a person to making them disappear? The answer came from a former co-worker of Michael's, a man named David Carter. In 1989, David worked with Michael at a repair company. He remembered Michael talking about Rachel. Frequently. Too frequently. At first, David thought Michael simply had a crush. A harmless obsession. But then Michael began saying things that made him uncomfortable. He talked as if Rachel belonged to him. As if he had some kind of connection with her that she did not share. David remembered one conversation. Michael was angry. He said Rachel had been asking too many questions. At the time, David ignored it. Years later, he realized those words might have meant something. Investigators looked into Rachel's final weeks again. They discovered she had been researching something connected to Michael. Financial records. Company documents. Repair invoices. Rachel had discovered irregularities. Missing equipment. False service reports. Information that could damage Michael's career. The possibility emerged. Rachel was not just someone Michael wanted. She was someone who could expose him. And that gave investigators a possible motive. Fear. Control. Silence. The same pattern seen in many crimes where a person tries to remove the one person who knows too much. But prosecutors knew the case would not be simple. The defense would challenge everything. The age of the evidence. The reliability of memories. The interpretation of old documents. They would argue that investigators were creating a story because they finally had a suspect. And there was one major obstacle. Rachel's remains had never been found. Without finding Rachel, prosecutors faced a difficult challenge. They had to prove what happened without the final piece. So investigators expanded the search. They returned to locations connected to Michael. Properties he owned. Places he worked. Areas he frequently visited. They used modern technology. Ground scanners. Forensic mapping. Advanced search methods. And after weeks of searching, they found something unusual. A location outside Willow Creek. A piece of land Michael had rented shortly after Rachel disappeared. A place never searched in 1989. Because nobody knew it existed. When investigators entered the property, they found something buried beneath layers of soil. A container. Old. Rust-covered. Hidden carefully. Inside were personal items. Items connected to Rachel Monroe. The discovery stunned investigators. Because after 37 years, the missing woman who had haunted Kansas finally had another connection to the man accused of taking her away. The case had reached a turning point. But the most shocking discovery was still inside that container. A handwritten letter. A letter written in 1989. A letter that appeared to explain why Rachel Monroe disappeared. And when investigators read the first line, they realized they were no longer searching for answers. They were uncovering a confession hidden for decades. The letter was only 2 pages long. 2 fragile pages. Yellowed by time. Folded and hidden inside a rusted container buried beneath the ground. For 37 years, it remained untouched. No one knew it existed. No one knew the words written inside would eventually become the center of one of Kansas' most shocking cold case investigations. When detectives unfolded the paper, the room became silent. Because the handwriting belonged to Michael Voss. And the first sentence changed everything. I thought I could fix this. 4 words. A sentence that revealed fear, regret, and something investigators had been searching for since Rachel Monroe vanished. A connection between Michael and the truth. The letter did not begin like a confession. It did not contain a direct admission. It did not describe every detail of what happened. But it revealed something more disturbing. Michael's state of mind. His obsession. His anger. His belief that Rachel had ruined his life. The letter described a person who felt betrayed. A person who believed Rachel had embarrassed him. A person who believed he had no other choice. Investigators immediately sent the letter for forensic examination. They analyzed the handwriting, the ink, the paper, the age of the document. The results confirmed what they feared. The letter had been written in 1989, the same year Rachel disappeared, the same year Michael claimed he had nothing to do with her. The discovery became the final piece prosecutors needed. But the investigation did not stop, because detectives wanted to know everything, not just what happened, but why. They went back to Rachel's life before the disappearance. They studied her final months, her conversations, her concerns, her decisions, and they uncovered a story that had been hidden beneath the original investigation. Rachel had discovered something about Michael, something she believed was serious enough to report. The documents showed Rachel had been reviewing records at the insurance company where she worked. She noticed inconsistencies connected to repair claims involving companies Michael worked with. At first, Rachel thought it was an accounting mistake, a simple error. But the more she looked, the more unusual things became. Invoices that did not match, services that were never completed, equipment that disappeared. Rachel began asking questions. And according to investigators, those questions made Michael nervous. Because Rachel was not just discovering information. She was documenting it. She was creating a record that could expose him. The investigators believed this was the moment everything changed. Michael had been interested in Rachel for months. But when he realized she could damage his future, the obsession became something darker. Control. Fear. Desperation. The letter appeared to confirm that. Michael wrote about losing everything, about being watched, about Rachel destroying everything he built. But the most disturbing part was a sentence near the end. She was never supposed to find out. Investigators believed those words revealed intent. They believed Rachel had uncovered something Michael wanted hidden. And when she refused to stay silent, he made sure she could never speak again. The arrest came early on a Tuesday morning. Before sunrise, the streets of Willow Creek were quiet. Most residents had no idea that after nearly 4 decades, the past was finally arriving. Police vehicles surrounded Michael Voss' home. Neighbors watched from their windows. The same community that had once searched for Rachel was now watching the person accused of taking her away. Michael stepped outside. Older. Gray-haired. A man who had spent most of his life believing the secret would remain buried. But the world had changed. Technology had changed. And the evidence he thought was gone had returned. When officers placed handcuffs around his wrists, one detective later described the moment as surreal. Because the case did not feel like a new investigation. It felt like history catching up. The news spread immediately. 37-year-old Kansas mystery solved. Cold case breakthrough leads to dramatic arrest. Forgotten fingerprint identifies suspected killer. The community reacted with shock. Some people remembered Michael as quiet, helpful, friendly. Others admitted they always felt something was wrong. They remembered moments that seemed strange. Small things. Comments. Behaviors. Things that did not make sense until now. One neighbor recalled seeing Michael watching Rachel's house late at night. Another remembered him asking questions about her schedule. Questions that seemed harmless at the time. But after the arrest, those memories took on a different meaning. The investigation also revealed another disturbing detail. After Rachel disappeared, Michael continued living normally. He attended community events. He worked. He spoke with neighbors. He built a new life. A life built on a secret. That was one of the hardest realities for the people of Willow Creek to accept. The person responsible had not vanished. He had been there. living among them, while Rachel's family waited for answers. For Rachel's mother, the arrest brought complicated emotions. Relief, anger, pain. After decades of wondering, she finally knew who had taken her daughter. But she also knew something else. No arrest could bring Rachel back. No courtroom decision could restore 37 lost years. The trial preparations began immediately. Prosecutors built their case around the evidence collected over decades. The fingerprint, the DNA, the letter, the hidden container, the witnesses, the timeline. The defense prepared to challenge everything. They argued the letter was open to interpretation. They questioned the evidence chain. They claimed investigators were influenced by the desire to solve a famous cold case. The courtroom battle was about to begin. But before the first hearing, investigators made one final discovery. A discovery hidden inside Rachel's old personal belongings. A small notebook recovered from her apartment. A notebook that contained the final words Rachel ever wrote. And those words revealed something terrifying. Rachel knew she was in danger. She knew someone was watching her. She knew something was wrong. But she never imagined the person she feared would become the last person she ever saw. The notebook contained one final entry. 3 sentences. 3 sentences written the night before she disappeared. And the final sentence left investigators speechless. Because it named the person Rachel believed was following her. Michael Voss. After 37 years, Rachel Monroe had finally spoken. And now the entire world was listening. The notebook changed the case forever. For 37 years, investigators had tried to understand Rachel Monroe's final days. They had searched through reports, interviewed witnesses, reviewed evidence, reconstructed timelines. But one thing was always missing: Rachel's own voice. The woman at the center of the investigation had disappeared, leaving behind only the memories of others. Until now. The small notebook recovered from her apartment became the closest thing detectives had ever found to a direct message from Rachel herself. A final warning. A final record. A final attempt to explain what was happening around her. Inside the notebook were ordinary entries at first. Daily routines. Work notes. Shopping lists. Small reminders. The details of a normal life. But as the pages continued, the tone began to change. The writing became shorter. More urgent. The words appeared rushed. As if Rachel was writing while afraid someone might interrupt her. Investigators noticed a pattern. The entries began after Michael Voss increased his presence in her life. Rachel wrote about feeling watched. About seeing the same vehicle near her apartment. About receiving silent phone calls. About the uncomfortable feeling that someone knew where she was before she ever said where she planned to go. For years, those details existed only as rumors. Now they were written in Rachel's own handwriting. The final pages were the most disturbing. The handwriting was uneven. The sentences were incomplete. The last entry was dated March 13, 1989. One day before she disappeared. Rachel wrote, "Something is wrong." Then below it, "I think he knows." And finally, "Michael cannot find out what I have." Investigators stared at those words for hours. Because the sentence raised a new question. What did Rachel have? What had she discovered? What was important enough to make her fear Michael Voss? The answer was hidden in another part of the investigation. The financial records. After reviewing old documents, detectives discovered Rachel had copied information from several insurance claims connected to Michael's repair business. She had found evidence suggesting fraudulent activity. False invoices. Duplicate charges. Payments for services that were never completed. The evidence was not just suspicious. It could have destroyed Michael's career. Rachel was not simply someone Michael became obsessed with. She was a threat. She was someone who could expose him. The prosecution believed this was the motive. Not jealousy. Not a random act. Fear of consequences. Fear of losing everything. The kind of fear that causes people to make irreversible choices. But the defense argued differently. They claimed investigators were creating a story around incomplete information. They argued Rachel's notebook showed she was afraid of Michael. But fear alone did not prove murder. They said the evidence showed Michael knew Rachel. Nothing more. They insisted there were still unanswered questions. And they were right about one thing. The biggest question remained unanswered. Where was Rachel? Finding evidence was one thing. Finding the victim was another. Without Rachel's remains, the case had a missing piece. The investigators knew that. The prosecutors knew that. The defense knew that. Everyone understood what was at stake. The search expanded across Kansas. Detectives examined old properties connected to Michael. They studied satellite images. They reviewed historical maps. They searched locations Michael had access to in 1989. And then they found another forgotten connection. A rural property outside Willow Creek. A place Michael had rented for only 6 months after Rachel disappeared. The rental records had never been examined during the original investigation. Because in 1989, nobody knew Michael had access to the property. The landowner remembered almost nothing. But one detail stood out. Michael had asked for privacy. He had specifically requested a location away from neighbors. At the time, it seemed unusual. Now, investigators saw it differently. They searched the property again. The first examination revealed nothing. But modern technology provided new possibilities. Ground-penetrating equipment detected unusual areas beneath the soil. Places where the ground had been disturbed. Places where something had been buried. The search continued for days. The community watched closely. Every discovery created rumors. Every police vehicle created questions. People wondered if the mystery was finally ending. Then, one morning, investigators found something. A small object buried beneath the ground. A piece of jewelry. A necklace. Rachel's necklace. Her family immediately recognized it. It was the necklace she wore in the last photograph taken before she disappeared. The discovery was devastating, because after decades of uncertainty, it proved something the family had feared. Rachel had not simply left. She had not started a new life. She had never escaped. She had been a victim. The search continued. And days later, investigators discovered more evidence. Personal belongings. Clothing. Items that connected Rachel directly to the property. The case had reached a point where the investigators no longer needed to ask whether Michael was involved. The question became how much he had hidden, and how long he believed he could get away with it. Michael Voss remained silent, even after the discoveries, even after the evidence, even after the arrest. He refused to admit involvement. His attorneys released a statement claiming the investigation was based on desperation. They argued that investigators had waited nearly 40 years to find someone to blame. But public opinion had already shifted. The community that once wondered what happened to Rachel now believed they finally knew. The trial began months later. The courtroom was packed. Journalists filled every seat. Families of victims from other cold cases watched closely. Because Rachel's case represented something larger. A question that haunted every unsolved investigation. Can justice still arrive after decades? The prosecution opened with a simple statement. Time did not erase the evidence. Time preserved it. They described the case as a puzzle with pieces scattered across 37 years. The fingerprint. The DNA. The notebook. The letter. The hidden property. The witnesses. They argued every piece pointed toward the same person. Michael Voss. The defense attacked immediately. They questioned the reliability of old evidence. They questioned memories. They questioned the interpretation of Rachel's notebook. They told the jury that a person could be suspicious without being guilty. They warned against turning tragedy into assumption. The courtroom battle became a fight between two stories. The prosecution's story. A woman discovered a secret. A man feared exposure. A crime was committed. The defense's story. A woman disappeared. Years passed, and investigators built a case around the person they wanted to blame. The jury listened. But then prosecutors introduced the evidence that changed the atmosphere inside the courtroom. Rachel's final notebook entry. Her handwriting. Her fear. Her warning. Her final words before disappearing. The prosecutor slowly read the sentence aloud. I think Michael knows. The courtroom became silent. Because those words were not written by investigators. They were not created after the fact. They came from Rachel herself. The woman who vanished. The woman who had spent 37 years waiting to be heard. And as the trial continued, Another revelation was about to emerge. A witness who had never spoken publicly. A person who had been too afraid in 1989. Someone who claimed they saw Michael Voss on the night Rachel disappeared. And their testimony would change everything. Because after 37 years, someone was finally ready to tell the world what they saw. The witness walked into the courtroom carrying a secret that had followed them for 37 years. A secret buried under fear. A memory they had tried to forget. A moment from one night in March 1989 that they believed would never matter again. But now, after decades of silence, that memory was about to become one of the most important pieces of the entire investigation. Her name was Linda Harper. In 1989, Linda lived only 3 houses away from Rachel Monroe. She was not a close friend. Not family. Not someone investigators considered central during the original investigation. Just a neighbor. Someone who lived close enough to see something, but not close enough for anyone to believe it mattered. When Rachel first disappeared, Linda spoke with police. She answered questions. She told them what she remembered. But there was one detail she never mentioned. One detail she kept hidden. Because she was afraid. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of accusing someone innocent. And most importantly, afraid of Michael Voss. The courtroom listened as Linda described the night Rachel disappeared. She remembered waking up around midnight. A sound outside. A vehicle. A door closing. At first, she ignored it. In a quiet neighborhood, people came and went. Cars started. Doors closed. Life continued. But then she looked outside. And she saw something that stayed in her memory for nearly 4 decades. Rachel's car. Parked near the street. And standing beside it. Michael Voss. The courtroom became completely silent. Because until that moment, prosecutors had evidence connecting Michael to Rachel. But Linda's testimony placed him at the center of the timeline. The night Rachel vanished. The location Rachel was last seen. The vehicle that later became the key piece of evidence. The defense immediately challenged her memory. They questioned why she waited 37 years to speak. They asked why she never reported seeing Michael. Linda looked down. And then she answered. Because I was afraid nobody would believe me. She explained what happened after Rachel disappeared. She said Michael came to her house 2 days later. He asked if she had seen anything. At the time, she thought it was strange. Why would someone who was not family, someone who was barely connected to Rachel, care so much about what a neighbor saw? Linda said Michael looked nervous. Not sad. Not confused. Nervous. She remembered his exact words. People should stop asking questions. The defense objected. The judge allowed the testimony. And the courtroom heard the sentence that investigators believed explained everything. Michael was not searching for Rachel. He was searching for what people knew. The prosecution argued that this was the behavior of someone trying to control the investigation. Someone trying to understand how much evidence existed. Someone trying to protect a secret. The trial continued. Witness after witness returned to the past. Co-workers described Rachel's final weeks. Neighbors described unusual events. Experts explained the forensic evidence. But the most powerful testimony came from someone unexpected. A former police detective, James Whitmore. He was one of the original investigators assigned to Rachel's disappearance in 1989. Now retired. Now older. But still carrying the frustration of a case he never solved. He entered the courtroom slowly. And before speaking, he looked toward Rachel's family. He apologized. Not because he believed he failed, but because he believed the system failed them. He explained what the investigation was like in 1989. No advanced DNA analysis. No national fingerprint databases. No digital tracking. Every clue had to be processed manually. Every connection had to be discovered through traditional police work. And he admitted something painful. Michael Voss was questioned. But he was never considered a serious suspect. Why? Because Michael appeared cooperative. He answered questions. He showed concern. He seemed like someone helping. The detective told the jury that was the mistake. They focused on people who acted suspicious. But they did not consider someone who acted normal. That statement became one of the most important moments of the trial. Because it revealed the hidden danger of the case. Michael did not escape because he was smarter than everyone. He escaped because he looked ordinary. The prosecution then presented the final forensic evidence. The fingerprint. The same fingerprint that started the modern investigation. Experts explained how the technology worked, how the print had been preserved, how it matched Michael Voss. The defense attempted to create doubt. They argued that Michael could have touched the vehicle before. They suggested innocent explanations. But prosecutors returned to the same point. Michael had always claimed he barely knew Rachel. He claimed he had no reason to be connected to her vehicle. Yet evidence kept placing him there. Again. And again. And again. Then came the DNA evidence. The forensic specialist explained the sample recovered from the vehicle. The probability of another person matching the DNA profile was extremely low. The courtroom listened carefully, because this was no longer just a fingerprint, no longer just memories. It was physical evidence, scientific evidence, evidence that survived 37 years. The prosecutor turned toward the jury. Rachel Monroe left behind the truth, he said. She left it in her car. She left it in her notebook. She left it in the evidence room. The only thing missing was someone willing to look. The words became one of the most repeated lines from the trial. Because that was exactly what happened. The truth was not discovered. It was uncovered. But as the trial moved closer to its conclusion, the defense made one final attempt. They introduced a new theory. A theory that shocked the courtroom. They claimed another person may have been responsible. They suggested Rachel's financial investigation could have exposed someone else. Someone who wanted her silent. They argued Michael was simply the person investigators found after years of searching. A convenient suspect. A man whose connection looked stronger because people wanted closure. The prosecution prepared its response. And what they revealed next changed the entire courtroom. Because they had found one final piece of evidence. A document hidden in Michael Voss' personal records. A document that connected him directly to Rachel's final moments. A document that showed he had lied about one critical detail. A detail he could no longer explain. The courtroom waited. The jury waited. Rachel's family waited. After 37 years, the final truth was about to come out. And this time, there would be nowhere left for Michael Voss to hide. The document was only one page. A single sheet of paper. No dramatic title. No obvious confession. Nothing that looked powerful enough to change a 37-year-old investigation. But investigators knew better. Because sometimes the smallest pieces of evidence create the biggest cracks. And this document created a crack that Michael Voss could not repair. The paper was an old service record. A maintenance log from March 14, 1989. The same night Rachel Monroe disappeared. The same night Michael claimed he had no contact with her. The record showed something impossible. Michael had been called to Rachel's apartment building that evening. Not days before. Not weeks before. That night. Hours before she vanished. The discovery stunned investigators. Because Michael had told police in 1989 that he was nowhere near Rachel's apartment. He said he had no reason to be there. He said the last time he saw Rachel was months earlier. The document proved he was lying. And for prosecutors, that lie became more important than the document itself. Because a lie does not automatically prove murder. But a lie about your connection to a missing person can reveal what someone is trying to hide. The prosecution presented the service record slowly. They wanted the jury to understand what it meant. Michael was not a stranger. He was not a random person whose fingerprint appeared by coincidence. He had access. He had opportunity. And according to investigators, he had motive. The defense attempted to explain the record. They claimed Michael may have forgotten the appointment. They suggested paperwork errors were common. They argued that an old document from 37 years ago could not be trusted completely. But the prosecution had another question. If the service call was innocent, why did Michael deny it existed? Why did he erase a connection that could have been harmless? Why create a lie if there was nothing to hide? The courtroom became focused on one idea. The pattern. Not one piece of evidence. Not one mistake. The pattern. Rachel feared him. Michael watched her. Michael appeared near her vehicle. Michael's fingerprint was found on her car. Michael's DNA was found inside the vehicle. Michael lied about his connection to her. And now, Michael had hidden a service record proving he was near her apartment that night. The evidence was building like a wall. But prosecutors knew the defense would continue fighting, because there was still one major question. What happened after Rachel left the restaurant? The prosecution needed to tell the jury that story. They needed to reconstruct the final hours of Rachel Monroe's life. And they did. Through technology. Through evidence. Through the words Rachel left behind. Investigators believed Michael approached Rachel in the parking lot. They believed he used their previous connection to gain access. A familiar face. A conversation. A reason for Rachel not to immediately fear him. That was the part that haunted detectives. Because the person Rachel feared was also someone she knew. Someone she had allowed into her home. Someone she never believed would become a threat. The prosecution argued that Michael convinced Rachel to let him help her. Maybe with her vehicle. Maybe with information. Maybe with a conversation. And once they were alone, everything changed. The vehicle was later found abandoned. But investigators believed Rachel was never inside it when it was discovered. They believed Michael moved the vehicle to create confusion. To make people believe she left voluntarily. To delay the search. And for 37 years. That plan worked. Until the fingerprint. Until the DNA. Until the old evidence spoke again. During the trial, prosecutors also presented analysis of Michael's behavior after the disappearance. They showed that he left Willow Creek shortly after the investigation intensified. At first, Michael claimed it was unrelated. A job opportunity. A fresh start. But investigators discovered something different. He left shortly after detectives began asking questions about his connection to Rachel. The timing raised suspicion. Then prosecutors revealed another detail. Michael had kept several items connected to Rachel. Not accidentally. Not because of an investigation. Because he chose to keep them. The photograph. The documents. The notebook copies. Items that showed a disturbing level of attachment. The defense argued that possession did not prove guilt. And technically they were correct. But prosecutors argued it showed obsession. A person who could not let go. A person who wanted control even after Rachel was gone. The emotional moment of the trial came when Rachel's sister, Emily Monroe, took the stand. She had spent 37 years waiting for this moment. For decades, she imagined what she would say if she ever faced the person responsible. But when she entered the courtroom, anger was not the first emotion people saw. It was sadness. She looked at Michael. And she described Rachel. Not the missing woman. Not the cold case. The person. She talked about Rachel's laugh. Her kindness. Her habit of helping strangers. Her dreams. The life that should have continued. Then she said something that silenced the courtroom. You didn't just take my sister. You took every year that came after. The statement became the emotional center of the trial. Because behind all the evidence was the reality everyone understood. A family had lost 37 years. A community had carried a mystery. A woman's life had been reduced to a case number. Until now. The final arguments began. The prosecution returned to the beginning. The missing woman. The abandoned car. The fingerprint. The forgotten evidence. They told the jury that the case was not about one clue. It was about a man who believed time would protect him. A man who believed old evidence would disappear. A man who believed nobody would ever look again. The defense gave their final statement afterward. They warned the jury not to confuse suspicion with proof. They reminded them that Michael was innocent until proven guilty. They argued that the prosecution had created a convincing story. But stories can be wrong. They asked the jury to separate emotion from evidence. The judge gave the instructions. The jury left. And the courtroom entered the longest silence of the entire case. Outside, reporters waited. The community waited. Rachel's family waited. The entire state waited. Because after 37 years, one question remained. Would the evidence finally be enough? Would the person accused of hiding the truth finally face justice? Or would the Kansas cold case remain unfinished once again? 2 days passed. Then 3. The jury reviewed every piece of evidence. Every photograph. Every statement. Every contradiction. Every unanswered question. And then on the 4th day, the courtroom doors opened. The jury had reached a decision. Michael Voss entered. The same man who had walked freely for 37 years. The same man who believed the past was buried. He stood. The judge looked toward the jury, and the entire courtroom held its breath. Because after nearly 4 decades, Rachel Monroe's story was about to receive its final answer. The courtroom had never been this quiet. Not during the testimony. Not during the evidence presentations. Not even during the most emotional moments of the trial. Because everyone understood what was happening. After 37 years of uncertainty, the final moment had arrived. A decision that would determine whether Rachel Monroe's disappearance would finally be answered, or whether another cold case would remain trapped between suspicion and doubt. The judge looked toward the jury. The jurors walked back into the courtroom slowly. Their faces revealed almost nothing. No one could read their decision. Not the reporters. Not the investigators. Not Rachel's family. Not even Michael Voss, the man who had spent nearly 4 decades avoiding this moment. The clerk stood. The courtroom rose. Then everyone sat again. The verdict was ready. Michael stared forward. For the first time since the investigation began, the man who had controlled the story for decades had no control left. No explicación. No escape. Only the decision of 12 people. The judge asked the jury foreperson if they had reached a verdict. The answer was yes. The document was handed over. The room became completely still. The clerk opened the paper. And then the words were spoken. Guilty. The sound was almost impossible to describe. A single word. But a word that carried 37 years of pain. 37 years of waiting. 37 years of unanswered questions. Rachel Monroe's family broke down. Not because the verdict erased what happened. It could not. Nothing could bring Rachel back. Nothing could restore the years stolen from them. But finally, the person responsible had been held accountable. The case that had haunted Kansas for decades was no longer unsolved. The mystery had an answer. The investigation had a conclusion. And the name Rachel Monroe was no longer connected only to disappearance. She was remembered as a person. A daughter. A sister. A friend. A woman whose life mattered. Michael Voss was sentenced to life in prison. During sentencing, the judge spoke about the unusual nature of the case. A crime hidden by time. A victim forgotten by the system. A family forced to live with uncertainty for nearly 4 decades. The judge described the evidence as a reminder that justice may be delayed. But it does not always disappear. The courtroom listened as Rachel's sister gave her final statement. She did not speak about revenge. She spoke about memory. She spoke about the years Rachel lost. The birthdays. The holidays. The conversations that never happened. She said the hardest part was not knowing. Not knowing where Rachel was. Not knowing if she was alive. Not knowing whether to keep hoping. She said uncertainty was its own kind of punishment. And now, finally, the uncertainty was gone. But outside the courthouse, the story continued. Because solving the case created another conversation. How did this happen? How did someone connected to a disappearance remain free for 37 years? The answer was complicated. It was not because investigators did not care. It was not because nobody searched. The truth was much more difficult. The evidence existed. But the connection did not. In 1989, the fingerprint found on Rachel's vehicle had no name attached. The DNA evidence could not be tested. The records were scattered. Witness memories were incomplete. The tools needed to solve the case simply did not exist. Time was not protecting Michael because he was invisible. Time was protecting him because the evidence was trapped. Until technology unlocked it. That became the biggest lesson of Rachel Monroe's case. A cold case is not always a dead case. Sometimes it is a sleeping case, waiting for the world to catch up. After the trial, investigators reviewed every step of the investigation. They wanted to understand what happened, not just to solve Rachel's case, but to prevent future cases from remaining unanswered. They studied the original evidence. They studied the mistakes. They studied the moments where the truth came close. And they discovered something haunting. The original detectives had been closer than anyone realized. Michael Voss had appeared in the investigation from the beginning. His name was already there. His connection was already there. The clues existed. They simply did not have enough information to understand them. That realization stayed with many investigators. Because cold cases are often not solved by discovering something new. They are solved by discovering something old. something everyone had already seen. But nobody had seen the right way. The fingerprint that solved Rachel's case became a symbol. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was impossible, but because it was ordinary. A simple mark left behind. A mistake made by someone who believed nobody would ever find it. Michael Voss thought time would erase him from the investigation. Instead, time preserved the evidence against him. Every year that passed kept the fingerprint waiting, kept the DNA waiting, kept Rachel's story waiting. The community of Willow Creek changed after the verdict. For years, Rachel's disappearance had been a shadow. People avoided talking about it. Some believed they would never know the truth. Some believed the case would remain forever unsolved. But after the trial, the conversation changed. People began talking about Rachel again. Not about the crime. About her life. Former classmates shared memories. Neighbors told stories. Friends described the person they knew before she became a headline. A memorial was created in her honor. A place where people could remember Rachel without remembering only the tragedy. Because that was important to her family. They did not want Rachel to be remembered only by the night she vanished. They wanted people to remember the years before. The laughter. The kindness. The dreams. The person behind the case file. The investigation also inspired renewed attention toward other cold cases. Authorities across Kansas reviewed old evidence. They reopened forgotten investigations. They searched for connections. Because Rachel's case proved something powerful. A file sitting untouched is not necessarily a file without answers. It may simply be a file waiting for the right moment. Waiting for the right technology. Waiting for the right person to ask the right question. And somewhere inside another evidence room, another box may be holding another truth. Another victim. Another family waiting. Another mystery that seems impossible. But Rachel Monroe's story showed that impossible does not mean unsolvable. It means unfinished. And unfinished stories can still reach their final chapter. Years after the verdict, one investigator involved in the case returned to the old evidence room. The same room where the fingerprint had been stored. The same place where Rachel's file sat untouched for decades. He looked at the evidence box. The photographs. The documents. The reports. And he said something that stayed with everyone who heard it. The answer was here the whole time. Because that was the most shocking part of the Kansas 1989 cold case. The truth was never gone. It was never destroyed. It was never lost. It was simply waiting. Waiting for someone to open the file. Waiting for someone to look again. Waiting for someone to believe that even after 37 years, justice was still possible. The conviction of Michael Voss closed the courtroom chapter of the Rachel Monroe case. But it did not close the emotional wounds left behind. Because some crimes do not end when the verdict is announced. Some crimes continue living in the memories of those who survived them. For 37 years, Rachel's disappearance was not just a police investigation. It was a constant presence. A question that followed people through their lives. A reminder that someone could vanish. And the world could keep moving. But for the people who loved Rachel, the world never truly moved forward. Her family remained frozen in that moment. March 14th, 1989. The last night anyone saw her. The last conversation. The last smile. The last ordinary moment before everything changed. After the trial, Rachel's sister returned to the house where their family had spent decades waiting for answers. Inside was a collection of memories. Photographs. Letters. Old birthday cards. Things that seemed ordinary before Rachel disappeared. But after her disappearance, every object became important. Every picture became a reminder. Every memory became something precious. Because when someone disappears, families do not only lose a person. They lose the future they imagined. They lose the moments that were supposed to happen. They lose the conversations that will never take place. That was the part of the case many people outside the family never understood. The crime happened in 1989. But the pain continued every single day afterward. The investigation may have ended. But the waiting did not. Until finally, after decades, the waiting stopped. The discovery of the truth brought relief. But it also brought a painful reality. Rachel was never coming home. The same evidence that solved the mystery also confirmed the worst fear her family carried. And that contradiction became one of the most heartbreaking parts of the case. Justice arrived. But it arrived carrying grief. After the trial, investigators began studying the impact of the case on cold case investigations nationwide. Rachel Monroe's case became an example of how technology could transform forgotten evidence. Because the investigation did not succeed because of one dramatic breakthrough. It succeeded because dozens of small pieces finally connected. A fingerprint, a DNA sample, a forgotten report, a witness who finally spoke, a notebook, a hidden letter. Each piece alone was incomplete, but together they created a picture that could no longer be ignored. That was the power of the investigation. Not one clue. The connection between clues. For decades, Michael Voss believed those pieces would remain separated. He believed the fingerprint would stay unidentified. He believed old witnesses would never speak. He believed documents would remain buried. He believed time would protect him. But time did something unexpected. Time preserved everything. The evidence survived. The memories survived. Rachel's name survived. And eventually the truth survived. The investigators who worked the final stages of the case later admitted something surprising. They did not solve Rachel's disappearance because they were searching for a killer. At first, they were searching for answers. They reopened the file because Rachel deserved another look. Because her family deserved another attempt. Because every unanswered case deserves someone willing to ask one more question. And that mindset changed everything. The modern investigation did not begin with Michael Voss. It began with Rachel. With the victim. With the person whose voice had been lost. That became the most important lesson from the case. Cold cases are not just old crimes. They are unfinished stories. And every unfinished story has someone waiting at the center. Someone who deserves to be remembered. The old police station in Willow Creek eventually changed. New officers arrived. New detectives replaced the people who worked the original investigation. But one thing remained. Rachel's file. It was preserved as a reminder. A reminder of what can happen when evidence is ignored. And what can happen when someone refuses to stop searching. The fingerprint that changed everything was eventually placed into the department's historical archive. Not as a trophy. Not as a symbol of victory. But as a reminder. A reminder that the smallest details can carry the biggest truths. Investigators often described it as the quiet witness. It never spoke. It never moved. It never changed. It simply waited. And when the right technology arrived, it finally told its story. The story of a moment. A moment when Michael Voss believed nobody was watching. A moment when he left behind the evidence that would eventually destroy his freedom. The community of Willow Creek also changed after the case. The fear that surrounded Rachel's disappearance slowly transformed into remembrance. Annual gatherings were held in her honor. People shared stories. Families brought flowers. The town began remembering Rachel not as the woman from the missing posters, but as the person she had been before. That mattered. Because every victim in every cold case has a life before the crime. A childhood. A family. A personality. Dreams. Plans. People who love them. The tragedy of cold cases is that the mystery often becomes bigger than the person. Rachel Monroe's story had almost become that. A headline. A mystery. A question. But the final investigation restored something important. Her identity. Rachel was not just the woman whose disappearance shocked Kansas. She was a person whose life had value. And after 37 years, the world finally remembered that. The case also changed the way investigators viewed old evidence. They began reviewing other forgotten files. They reopened cases where evidence had been stored but never analyzed. They searched through old records. They contacted witnesses again. Because Rachel's case proved one powerful idea. The passage of time does not always weaken a case. Sometimes it strengthens it. Because technology improves. Because memories can be preserved. Because evidence can wait. Years after the verdict, a detective involved in the investigation visited the location where Rachel's car was discovered. The area looked different. New roads. New buildings. The world had moved on. But standing there, the detective imagined the night of March 14th, 1989. A woman driving into darkness. A family about to lose someone. A mystery beginning. He thought about how close the answer had been. How many times investigators had walked past the truth. how many years Rachel's family waited. And he realized something. The case was not solved because the truth finally appeared. The truth had always been there. It was solved because someone finally listened. Someone finally looked closer. Someone finally understood what the evidence was trying to say. The Kansas 1989 cold case became more than a criminal investigation. It became a reminder that every missing person has a story. Every piece of evidence has a purpose. Every family deserves answers. And every cold case, no matter how old, still has a heartbeat. Because somewhere, hidden inside forgotten files and silent evidence rooms, there may still be another fingerprint. Another clue. Another truth waiting to be discovered. Just like Rachel's. Just like the evidence that waited 37 years before revealing the name of the person responsible. The world thought the case was forgotten. But the truth was never forgotten. It was only waiting. For 37 years, the name Rachel Monroe represented a question. A question written in newspapers. A question repeated in conversations. A question that followed an entire community through decades of silence. What happened to Rachel Monroe? That question remained unanswered through changing generations. Children who were young when Rachel disappeared became adults. Detectives retired. Witnesses grew older. The original evidence boxes became forgotten pieces of history. But the question remained. Because some cases do not disappear. They wait. And Rachel's case was one of them. The final chapter of the investigation did not begin with a dramatic confession. It did not begin with a suspect walking into a police station. It began with something much smaller. A fingerprint. A single mark left behind on a vehicle in 1989. A piece of evidence that seemed meaningless. A detail that sat untouched for decades. But that fingerprint carried a message. A message that time could not erase. A message that eventually exposed the truth. Michael Voss believed he had defeated the investigation. He believed the passing years would protect him. He believed memories would fade. He believed evidence would become useless. But he misunderstood one thing. Time does not always destroy evidence. Sometimes time protects it. The fingerprint survived. The DNA survived. The documents survived. Rachel's words survived. And together, they created a path back to the truth. The case became one of the most unforgettable examples of how cold cases can suddenly return from the shadows. A mystery that seemed permanently buried. A disappearance that seemed impossible to solve. A family that had spent decades waiting for answers. All of it changed because investigators decided to look again. That decision transformed everything. Because the difference between an unsolved case and a solved case is sometimes not a new clue. Sometimes it is a new perspective. The evidence was always there. The truth was always there. But nobody had connected the pieces until the right moment arrived. And when that moment came, the entire story changed. The community of Willow Creek never forgot Rachel. Even during the years when there were no answers. Her name remained. Her photograph remained. The memory of her remained. The missing posters eventually disappeared from store windows. The newspaper articles became old archives. The conversations became quieter. But the people who loved Rachel never stopped searching. That was the part of the story that technology could never measure. The determination of a family. The patience of investigators. The belief that someone missing is never just a forgotten case number. Someone is always waiting for them. Someone is always hoping. Someone is always asking questions. And those questions eventually led back to Michael Voss. The man who believed the past was buried. The man who built a new life while Rachel's family lived with uncertainty. The man whose secret survived for decades. Until the evidence finally spoke. The arrest shocked the community. But the conviction brought something different. Closure. Not happiness. Not celebration. Closure. Because justice in cases like Rachel's is complicated. There is no victory that can replace a lost life. No sentence that can return stolen years. No verdict that can erase pain. But there is something powerful about finally knowing. Knowing what happened. Knowing who was responsible. Knowing that the person who caused the suffering could no longer hide. For Rachel's family, the verdict marked the end of one journey. A journey filled with questions. A journey filled with disappointment. A journey filled with moments when they wondered if the truth would ever arrive. But the truth did arrive. It arrived decades later. It arrived through technology, through persistence, through evidence that refused to disappear. And perhaps that is the most haunting part of Rachel Monroe's story. The answer was not impossible. It was waiting. The fingerprint that changed the investigation was not created by modern technology. It was created by one moment in 1989. A moment when someone left behind proof. A moment that would eventually return and reveal everything. The case became a warning for anyone who believes time can erase wrongdoing. Because time remembers. Evidence remembers. And sometimes, the smallest mistake can become the loudest voice. Years after the trial, investigators continued receiving messages from families connected to other cold cases. People who heard Rachel's story and wondered if their own unanswered mysteries could also be solved. They asked questions. They reopened files. They searched again. Because Rachel's case proved something important. Hope is not the same as certainty. But hope keeps people looking. And sometimes looking again changes everything. The final image of the Rachel Monroe investigation was not the courtroom. It was not the arrest. It was not the evidence table. It was a quiet moment. A detective standing inside an old evidence room. Surrounded by boxes. Surrounded by forgotten stories. Each box representing someone who had waited. Someone whose family wanted answers. Someone whose name deserved to be spoken again. The detective looked at Rachel's old file. The same file that had sat for decades. The same file that held the clues. And he understood something. The case was never truly cold. It was only waiting. Waiting for someone to return. Waiting for someone to ask one more question. Waiting for someone to believe that the truth was still there. The California 1988 cold case solved. The Kansas 1989 mystery that shocked a community. The stories of missing people across the country. They all share the same message. A case is not defined by how long it remains unsolved. A case is defined by the moment someone refuses to stop searching. Rachel Monroe's story ended with justice. But it began with silence. A silence that lasted 37 years. A silence broken by a fingerprint. A fingerprint that carried the truth across decades. A fingerprint that proved one terrifying reality. You can hide a crime. You can bury evidence. You can run from the past. But the past has a way of returning. And when it does, it remembers everything. Because somewhere inside every forgotten file, every abandoned investigation, and every unanswered question, there may still be a clue waiting. A clue that has been silent for years. A clue that only needs one person to find it. One person to believe. One person to look again. And when that happens, the cold case is no longer cold. The truth wakes up. The mystery ends. And justice finally arrives.